Hello, Rank Squad, and welcome to UELtras here on Ranks FC. Yes, we're back, the show that talks about Europe's two most exciting club competitions as we head into the knockout stages of the Europa League and Europa Conference League. It's all incredibly exciting. Now, for those of you who haven't been here before, let me start this off with a little analogy because the Champions League is great. Nobody doubts that whatsoever. It is the pinnacle of European competition. But think of the Champions League like a glitzy awards ceremony. Yes, the winners take all the headlines. There's a little bit of gossip here and there, but ultimately it's a classy event, top tier, and you've had a really nice time. The Europa League is the after party in the club. And what's going on here is everyone's a little bit looser, everything's a little bit more up in the air, and things really start to get going. Yes, the party and the award ceremony take all their headlines, but really, the place you want to be is in the Europa League. Now, the Europa Conference League is 6 in the morning in a random kitchen. You're not sure how you've got there. You're not sure really who anyone is at this point, but you know that once you're in, even if you're not sure you fully want to be there. And you're wondering how you're going to take the day off work the next day in order to deal with the fallout of this. These are the competitions. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the after party. And I want to start things off with a little bit of admin, I suppose, a little bit how this works. And I got this from Luke Shaw. He said, dumb question to start, but can you just explain how the next round and the rest of the tournament works? Well, yes, I can, Luke. It's relatively simple when it comes to the Europa League and the Conference League. And what we're looking at here is, let's take the Europa League, for example. The 8 teams who finish second in the group go through into a playoff round. The 8 teams who win the group go straight into the last 16. Those second place teams face off home and away in a 2-legged affair in the playoff round against the teams who drop down from the Champions League, the teams who finished in third place in the Champions League, in order to play those first place teams in the round of 16. Now, it all takes place a little bit quicker than the Champions League because we see all of the games take place today in the first legs, and then the second legs take place next week, and then in a couple of weeks' time, that round of 16 kicks off just as the second legs in the Champions League kick off. So everybody gets to the quarterfinals at the same stage. It's the same thing for the Conference League. The teams who win the group in the Conference League go straight into the round of 16. The teams who come second go into this playoff round against the teams who've dropped down from third place in the Europa League. And there's another draw for the Europa League and the Conference League after this round is finished, which will be in 8 days' time. And we'll look at that, and that will then draw the round of 16. There's another draw, just like in the Champions League, for the quarterfinals. And from there, it's a bracket all the way to the final. So no particular difficulties. It's a bit weird with the playoff round, but wanted to just get the admin out of the way before we began things. And look, that question is from Luke. UELtras is basically fueled, and the engine room is part of our Patreon community over on Patreon. If you're listening to this on Patreon, obviously you'll know. I'd love you to get your questions in. If you're watching this on YouTube and you want to be involved, get these questions in for next week's edition, then there's a link to the Patreon in the description. We'd love you to come and join us over there. Lots of fun. The next one's from Doug Leno, who says, a Dublin final. Surely this has to have Klopp's farewell written in the stars. However, it's not hard to argue that Liverpool are too big for the Europa League. Does the tournament benefit from teams like Liverpool, Barca and co in recent years, or are the best editions when it's two B-list sides battling out for a once-in-a-lifetime chance? A bit of both, I think. Obviously, we're seeing the new format and the Conference League introduction, meaning that the Europa League is far slimmed down from what it originally was. That original format had loads and loads of teams in it. It was a much bigger competition, and they've streamlined that into 2 formats. So since the streamlining, I think that obviously if there are teams who start in the competition, and this is something worth talking about, it's not new to those of you who've watched UELtras before or heard me talking about the Europa League before, but the teams that tend to win Europa League are not the teams that drop down from the Champions League, Sevilla aside. The teams that tend to win Europa League and the Conference League, from what we've seen so far, are the teams that begin in it and work their way through it. And it's the teams that take things seriously. If you respect the Europa League and the Conference League, they will respect you. If you drop down from the Champions League and you're like, ugh, don't want to be in this competition, we're just going to go through the motions and try and win it, you will probably get knocked out. Is what happens. Teams who buy into the competition tend to do better than those who look at it as a secondary prize. And from a Liverpool perspective, I think this is the one trophy that Klopp's been involved in at Liverpool that he hasn't won. And I think to go out by winning that trophy and completing the set, if you will, of every competition that he was part of at Liverpool will be a major factor. Now, whether that looks like that as they turn towards the final corner, if they're still in that title race and everything is on the line in the Premier League, obviously you have to look at different priorities. But I do think that Liverpool will be looking at this competition going, yes, we want to obviously win it, make sure that there's European silverware in Klopp's final season, and obviously in Dublin as well with the final. It's a nice link. There's a lot of people within Liverpool who will say that Liverpool is Ireland's 33rd county, that there is a massive Irish contingent within the Liverpool fan base. It all feels like it's geared up for something pretty special. So a little bit of both. I do think that teams who come down and take the competition seriously are always a benefit for the competition. And I think that there's something to be said for that. Teams who drop down and think that they're too big for the competition or don't give it the sincerity that it deserves tend to struggle. So we'll see how Liverpool approach this one when we get into that round of 16 proper. I'm going to go to Jake now, Jake Weedman, who says, which teams have the most to lose if things go wrong in the Europa League or the Conference League? A couple, I think. Let's start in the Europa League. West Ham, David Moyes reportedly on the brink, Graham Potter being lined up, but there is a sense that West Ham won't pull a trigger on that until this Europa League campaign comes to a close because he's earned the right to do that, winning the Conference League last year and having such a good record in the competition and European competition in the last few years. I think that many at West Ham, especially in the boardroom, will think, well, David Moyes has earned that right to lead West Ham through the knockout stage. And to be honest, as a cup team, I think West Ham have been pretty excellent, especially in these European competitions. And we've seen them bat away teams that were on paper better than them to come out and actually come out on top in various places. So I think that David Moyes potentially has the most to lose here because if West Ham drop out of the Europa League with mounting pressure on their league form, dropping out of that European race, I suppose they're still within the race, but dropping down the league table over the last couple of weeks and some pretty brutal results, I do think that if they were to crash out of the Europa League in the round of 16, for example, that could spell the end for David Moyes. It's a similar story at Marseille, who are not having the best season. The chaos has returned. It doesn't feel like Marseille are where they want to be, where they should be in Liga. You'd imagine that this is an opportunity to go on and say, okay, no, we're still a formidable force within Europe. We're still able to turn it on. They came out of a tough group, obviously, which had Ajax and Brighton in it. And to be able to get through that and get to this stage of the competition is probably something keeping them at it. Benfica are a slightly different case in that they are obviously still very much in the hunt for the Primeira title. They are in that conversation to battle Sporting at the top of the table. They've got 11 wins in 13 since December, I think. But equally, I think they would have expected more from the Champions League campaign, especially in a group with Real Sociedad. Now, Real Sociedad are a very good side, but I think Benfiquistas would have probably expected a little bit more. But I'm going to talk about Benfica a little bit more later. And then Milan, because Pioli is very much under pressure. And whilst that third spot in Serie A feels like it's relatively secure right now, I think the results towards the end of December, now there have been some caveat results that have turned things around a little bit and Milan have started to cook a little bit more again. But I do think that those results towards the end of December showed just how easy it would be for Milan to turn on Pioli. And look, I think he might end up leaving this summer anyway. If there was to be an embarrassing exit of the Europa League for Milan, I think that that might expedite the process, considering there's not huge amounts of silverware left to play for in the Milan camp. And look, similar vibes for someone like Ajax in the Conference League, who, yes, have turned things around. And again, we're going to talk about them later. They have turned things around and they have started to climb, but things are definitely not perfect. They've dropped down into the Conference League. They wouldn't have expected to be here. And now they're looking at it and going, right, well, we need to go on and prove that we are and we remain a team that can produce at the sharp end of European competitions. It's not all that long ago. Yes, there's been a high turnover of players, managers, the rest, but it's not that long ago since Ajax were everybody's favourite team in the Champions League semi-finals. And to have fallen this far from that grace in such a short period of time means that I think the pressure ratchets up on their Conference League campaign. Similar for Eintracht Frankfurt, who under Dino Topmoller haven't been great. I think that there has been a sense that obviously they didn't replace Randall Kolo Muani in the summer. Now Hugo Ekitiki's come in. There've been a kind of restructuring of the squad in January. Topmoller now has a squad that you look at and go, right, you should be doing better. And I think that this competition offers an opportunity to explore that. But equally, I think that the fans of Frankfurt are starting to feel like Topmoller might not be the man to lead them into a new era. It's going to be interesting to see what the reaction is if they were to have things go wrong in the Conference League in particular. Let's go to Ben Riley, who says, basic question, but who are the favourites for both competitions? And what are your dark horses that, if the draw is kind, could go on a run? I think Ajax are in with a shout of winning the Conference League to add to a trophy to what looked a pretty dire start to the season. Yeah, I mean, look, the Europa League favourites are Liverpool at 2-1, Bayer Leverkusen at 4-1, and Milan at 9-1. And the Conference League favourites are Aston Villa at 3-1, Fiorentina at 5-1, Frankfurt at 9-1, and Real Betis at 12-1. You're kind of there, I think, with those ones. I'm not saying that these teams will win the competition, but I think that looking at everybody left in the competition, they are reasonable favourites from the bookies. That Liverpool and Leverkusen are the two best sides left in the Europa League. I think by anybody's money, it's not difficult to suggest that a team that are top of the Premier League and a team that are top of the Bundesliga are both in with a shout of winning the Europa League, especially given Leverkusen's ridiculous 31-game unbeaten run across all competitions this season so far. I think Villa are the strongest squad by a mile in the Conference League. Fiorentina are here and there. They've had an up and down season, lost 2-0 to Bologna last night, which pushes them further away from those Champions League qualification spots. But having got to the final last year, you look at that and think, yeah, that's a reasonable place for them to be as second favourites, especially with not all that much strength in depth. Eintracht are too up and down, as are Betis, to consider them any tighter than outside favourites. But I do think that you're looking at Liverpool, Leverkusen, Villa and Fiorentina and thinking, well, if those four sides, or those two sides in each competition don't run into each other, and obviously the draw matters, they don't run into each other early, you'd imagine that they should, on paper, get to the finals of both competitions. The Europa League and the Conference League don't work on paper, but the favourites are there for a reason. We'll come on to dark horses because it was also asked by Nicholas Galindo and D-Boy. Nicholas said top 3 dark horses to win each competition. And D-Boy said, which teams from outside the top 5 leagues have the best shot at winning one of these competitions? I think in the Europa League, Atalanta are the dark horse in terms of not being favoured by the bookies. They're having an exceptionally impressive season in Serie A. They've opened the gap up from 4th spot in Serie A. And their front line is really clicking, considering they lost Ademola Lookman, who's been such an important player for them over the last couple of seasons, to AFCON in January. They had a really, really good month. And we're seeing Sharda Ketelara start to play some of his best football. Cope Miners completely running this team from midfield now. We're talking about players like Edison, who was desired by a lot of big clubs in this January window. We didn't see that spend to justify it, but I think they'll be more interested in him in the summer as a defensive midfielder. They're cooking again under Gasperini, and I think that gives them a real shot at going on, especially if the draw is kind, to come in and cause a stir in this competition, because the depth is there as well as the talent, and that's a nice place to be. Sporting as well from Portugal, and so the first one of the teams outside the top 5 leagues, D-Boy, are majestic at the moment, and they are blowing teams away when they play football. They have scored an immense amount of goals in the last couple of weeks, and Gyökeres has really taken to life in Portugal like a duck to water. In terms of what they can do, and I talked about Amorim on this week's main podcast on Ranks FC. If you haven't listened, make sure you go and do that, about what he's brought to this Sporting side and actually what they bring in terms of flexibility, versatility within the system that he's so fond of and they rarely stray from. It means that they are now coming into this second half of the season feeling like they're starting to push that accelerator rather than struggling from what they had before. And Galatasaray as well, who are top of the Super League in Turkey, have an incredibly interesting attacking core. They've only been shut out once in European competition this season. That was that last game against Copenhagen in the Champions League. And I think that as they start to build into the second half of this season, if things are kind to them, they could be a very interesting prospect because of what they can bring to the table. And look, Manchester United are a team that will justify or at least talk to that ability to make things happen out of nothing. And with Will Sahar, with Maracardi, there is an incredibly talented crop of forwards here. And I think it's going to be intriguing to see how they get on, especially if that draw just starts to favour them. From a Conference League perspective, I look at Ajax, as we say, that team aren't perfect yet, but I think in terms of going forwards, they have been pretty good under Van Skip. And the way that things are turning and they're starting to find a bit of a rhythm, yes, it was a bad result at the weekend, but it does feel like they've turned a corner and they're going to be pushing for this competition where upon quite a lot of this season now rests because it might be too far to those Champions League places in the Eredivisie. If they can go and win silverware, I think it would salvage what has been a pretty dreadful season all round. Lille are a really interesting side. They're the second least goals conceded in Liga. They've not been perfect, as we say, but they have pushed themselves back into that Champions League conversation. And I think they're improving week on week, which makes them an interesting prospect. And then there's Union Saint-Gilloise, who are top of the league in Belgium, but also have a team that seems to be stacked with real talent. And I'm intrigued by what they can bring to the table, considering what we saw from them in Europe last season, and that model continues to build and they continue to bring through really, really interesting players. So, yeah, USG probably the outside shout, but there's two, I think, from outside the top five on both of those counts: Sporting and Galatasaray in the Europa League, and Ajax and Union Saint-Gilloise from Belgium in the Conference League. Seth says, which of these ties has the potential for the most goals? I'm looking at Sporting Young Boys or Ajax Bodo Glimt. Yeah, I think they're both really good shouts. I would add Shakhtar, who were quite chaotic in the group stage of the Champions League, that 5-3 game against Porto, they came out the wrong side of. They haven't played football in 2 months. I'm going to throw their tie with Marseille in here because we all know Marseille are the most chaotic team in European football. And with that, I'm going to come on to some games to watch. There are some things here where there are a question or two, but mostly I've picked 3 games from each competition that I'm going to be keeping a particular eye on tonight, and I would suggest that you do as well. Feyenoord Roma, a repeat of the 2022 Conference League final, but also 2 teams in relatively good nick right now. And I think that there were question marks over De Rossi taking over, and obviously they lost to Inter at the weekend. I don't think there's any scandal in losing to this Inter team, who are put up there with the best teams in Europe. And Roma gave them a real scare. They've been interesting under De Rossi. They've gone back to that sort of 4 at the back formation that's allowed them a little bit more control in midfield. They've scored some interesting goals, and they possess some of the Europa League's most talented players. Now, obviously, they got to the final last year. They beat Feyenoord in the semi-finals. So there's some real European history in the last couple of years between these two sides. But actually, I think that this one could be interesting because Feyenoord at the Kuip in particular in this first leg have been immense. And obviously with Santi Jimenez leading the line, it's been a very good season. Now, PSV's domination of the Eredivisie has taken all the headlines, but quietly in second, and Feyenoord, having won the league last year, will obviously naturally be disappointed that they have fallen off from a title challenge. PSV have just been so good that it makes it hard to criticize anyone else. I think Feyenoord could be one of those teams you just keep an eye on here because at home in particular, they are a very, very good side. And the atmosphere will be incredible, I think, across the course of this. But also, you know, Roma are a new side in terms of the manager being different to what they were, the system being different. And they actually have struggled away from home in European competition. I think they've won one of their last 8, if I'm not mistaken, which was at the start of this year's campaign against Sheriff. It's not been great on the travels. Now, part of that is Mourinho's desire to keep things tight and obviously win games at home in order to progress. I get that. But I think that given how good, especially given how good that Feyenoord have been at home, this should be a really, really good game. I'm going to suggest that Feyenoord just about edge it, but I think this one will be really tight. I'm going to come on to AC Milan against Rennes because we talked about how important this competition could be to Milan. Now, obviously, they were in the group of death. And in the Champions League, which was Borussia Dortmund, Paris Saint-Germain, Newcastle United, I think there was obviously frustration with Milan's inability to progress, but I think that some of the performances that they put in and the fact that it was such a difficult group have probably allayed the fears around that a little bit. Now, they've had an interesting campaign. They didn't score very many goals. They scored 5 in the Champions League groups, and they took a lot of shots, and yet only Salzburg, I think, scored less goals than Milan across that group stage. But we've seen a turnaround since the end of December where there was that big wobble that I mentioned in the section about Pioli. They've had 4 wins from 5 since there. They beat Napoli at San Siro at the weekend. Teo Hernandez is in mighty form. And I think that overall, with the amount of talent in this side, the attacking prowess that Milan hold, a lot of people will be looking at this and going, well, they should dispatch Rennes pretty comfortably. I think that's harder said than done. Now, I think Milan win tonight at San Siro, but I don't think this is the demolition job that maybe some people are expecting. Rennes are in some really, really good form. They've won 7 on the spin since New Year's Day, and one of those, was on penalties against Marseille in the Coupe, but you look at it and think, okay, everything's been very, very impressive. And they've started to move up the table. They're a couple of points now off the European places in Liga. And Julian Stefan has done a very, very good job in turning this around since Genesio left. And I think it's 10 wins from 14 games, if I'm not completely mistaken. But the way that they played and they finished second to Villarreal in the group stage, there wasn't much between them. You remember, those of you who listened earlier on in the year and those of you who were listening at the end of the group stages, remember that really chaotic game between Rennes and Villarreal, which decided the group winners, which had goals chalked off, had mad finishes, end-to-end struggles. I think it ended 3-2 to Villarreal. It was incredible as a spectacle. But since then, I think Rennes have started to find a bit of rhythm. They weren't in great nick when they played that game against Villarreal and in the group stages of this in general. Now they're in really good nick. So I think this one should be really tight. I think it's going to be interesting to see the way that Rennes come out and attack. There's no Lefebvre. He's injured. But there is this sense of, Terrier and Callum Owendo in attack, supported by someone like Benjamin Bergard, who is one of the most creative players in Liga. I think this should be really good. I'm going to go 2-1 Milan, but I don't think there's much between these two. And on my third game, we have a question. It's Benfica to lose, and Francisco Silva says, UEL is back and Benfica are back at it. To be honest, I'm a bit like Jack in the sense that I love to see Benfica in the Europa League. Such good memories on our way to the 2 finals we played for players like Enzo Perez, Limo, Taquara Cardozo, Luisao, and Salvio. And I believe it's a competition that Benfica will be able to compete and genuinely push for a European title. Bayer Gutmann, look away. Yes, the curse of Gutmann back in play once again for Benfica. The question I have, says Francisco, is about a player that I'd love to know more about and plays our opponent. What can you tell me about Thijs de Linge, and what should we expect at Stade de Luche this Thursday from de Linge and Toulouse? The truth is, on Toulouse in general, I'll come on to de Linge. On Toulouse in general, they're a bit of a basket case because on one hand, they were sensational in the group stages of the Europa League. In the other hand, they've been absolutely dreadful in Liga and are flirting with relegation. And I'm not quite sure how they're doing both. It's something that you don't often see. They've basically finished the end of 2023 by not winning in 10 games domestically on the spin. They only won games in the Europa League, and they won some really, really big games in the Europa League. They lost to Nantes at the weekend, which has dragged them back into the relegation struggle after wins over Metz and Chaim, but they've won 1 in 17 home games in Liga this season, which is just dreadful form. And yet, when they turn up, they hear the Europa League theme music, Toulouse just seem to become a completely different beast. And when you're looking at a team like that, who are this unpredictable in terms of how bad they have been domestically and how good they have been continentally, it makes it incredibly, incredibly difficult to call. Thijs de Linger was exceptional in the group stage. He scored 4 goals, and to boost that, they went and signed Xavi Babicka from Aris Limassol. And when he came in, he scored 3 goals in the group stages of the Europa League, which we're kind of looking at and going, okay, they're building a Europa League squad. I think that's a really good signing. I think Babicka and de Linger should get on very well together. But I really like de Linger, and I think he has all the makings of a very, very good all-round number 9. He's got intelligent runs off the back stick. He's got that ability to get in behind. He finds space in the box, and that first-time ability to make a little bit of space for himself and get shot off, I think is something that you see from the best strikers. Will he be able to do that against this Benfica side? I don't know, especially with the rest of this team and their form completely and utterly up in the air. But I think de Linger has used this campaign as a platform to go, look, I am ready to make a step somewhere else, even if the worst happens and Toulouse get relegated. So I really like him. I think that there should be a lot of eyes on Thijs de Linger, someone that I've enjoyed watching for a little while. Someone that when I posted a meme to Sam and Dean a few weeks back, basically being like, "Oh, it's that meme of the girlfriend and boyfriend lying in bed, but I bet he's thinking about other women." It was like, I wonder if Thijs de Linger is ever going to be a top flight number 9, and I think he will be. I think he will be. I think there'll be real interest in the summer. I think he's a very, very smart player, and I like him a lot. So it's going to be intriguing to see how he plays against this Benfica defense. But Benfica, despite having some weird setbacks games, and I think that obviously the European campaign was a dreadful campaign, to be honest. You look at how they started, there was that 3-0 lead against Inter Milan that they squandered somehow. They won against Salzburg in Austria to turn things around and mean they jumped into third and got into the Europa League. But 13 games, 11 wins since that last game against Salzburg in the group stages of the Champions League. They've scored 35 goals. Artur Cabral starting to find his feet. It was a big goal in that game to prove the goal that they needed in order to actually make sure the goal difference was right to jump Salzburg. And from then, he started to make a difference. He came off the bench at the weekend and scored a late leveler against Vitoria, which obviously saw them drop points, but could have been worse. And I think he's starting to find his feet in this Benfica side. Obviously, they just sold Peter Musa as well to FC Dallas. I think there's a sense that Cabral is going to be the man that they look to going forward. And look, he took a while to get going at Fiorentina as well. So this isn't anything particularly new. But I think that this is a big competition for Benfica. And I think that when we're looking at the two teams from Portugal in Sporting and Benfica who are in this title race, I think Porto and Braga are out of it, to be perfectly honest with you. These are the two teams you're looking at and going, can you cause a splash here in the Europa League? And how far can you push it? I think that if Benfica start to click again in this competition, there's no doubt that they are better than this Toulouse side. That's not to say they'll beat them because, one, Europa League, and two, Toulouse are so unpredictable from continental to domestic that it means that anything can happen here. But I'd be surprised if they don't win tonight at the Luche. And that takes us on to the Conference League, which is nice. And I think we can move straight on to the early kickoff that I'm interested in, which is Union Saint-Gilloise against Eintracht Frankfurt, two teams I talked about at the top. It's going to be interesting to see how Frankfurt deal with this. Now, there's been a lot of press recently about the fact that Donny van der Beek joined and then wasn't included in the squad for the Europa Conference League. Top Mollers had to apologize to him, but you kind of look at USG and think, right, they're 8 clear at the top of the Belgian top flight. They lost at the Cup against Club Brugge at the weekend, but it's a 2-legged affair. There's a stress that you go, okay, where are they here? I think they have that space in the league. Obviously, the Belgian league is a bit different because it splits, and then there's a secondary phase, if you will. But I think that there is a sense that USG could come good in this competition. And I think that when you're looking at this Frankfurt side, we're still not quite sure what they bring to the table. And Hugo Larsson has been good, I think, since he joined. But does this mean that Ekiteke gets a start? Does Kalajdzic play here, considering his child is being born as we speak? All a bit conclusion. And then Marmoush has come back from AFCON. He's a game changer. I think he was Egypt's best player at that tournament. What does that look like? And this front four, now Chaibi, Ekiteke, I think will play ahead of Larson and Marmoush, is so interesting. So interesting. Mario Götze are pulling the strings from a bit deeper these days. On paper, Eintracht win this game. On paper, Eintracht should be winning more games than they have done all season. So what that actually looks like in real time, we don't know yet. But I think that at USG, this is a real test. And considering how good they've been in Belgium this season, Eintracht are going to need to up it if they're going to get anything out of this game. I'm going to suggest it's a draw, but I think that this one is a good fixture, as I think Ajax Bodo Glimt will be. That's a later kickoff. The first ones in both of these preview sections were early kickoffs. The latter two are laters. Ajax have turned it around, as we mentioned at the top, but then they go at the weekend and they lose 3-2 to Herenveen, which means they're 9 points adrift of Twente, and they have to play RZ Alkmaar at RZ before the end of the month, meaning that Champions League place looks incredibly out of place. Now, they score goals, Ajax, and that's going to be really interesting, but it's been 12 games since they kept a clean sheet in any competition. So we're looking at a side that, and look, I've talked about a lot of these, but these are the sides that tend to be fun in the Europa League and Conference League, and that's why I'm excited. I think that when Bodo Glimt saw this draw, back when it was done, they would have thought, yeah, absolutely, no bother whatsoever. Equally, I talked on the Champions League takeaway show about the fact that winter breaks really matter. And they haven't played in a couple of months. They definitely haven't played any competitive football in 2024. They've had a couple of friendlies. They played against Malmo. I think they played 4 friendlies. We saw from Copenhagen, it doesn't recreate what you're looking for. And going to the Johan Cruyff Arena to play an Ajax side who are expectant of a win is not ideal if you haven't played any competitive football. However, I think Ajax are rattleable and they concede. And if you go ahead early in this game, you can get the crowd right on their back. We've seen the Ajax crowd losing the plot this season already. This isn't anything new. And I think that if Knutson's side can come in here and get an early goal, get things started, it's going to be intriguing to see how that one develops. And I'm going to finish with Real Betis. Of course, you thought I wasn't going to talk about Betis, sitting here in a Betis shirt, against Dinamo Zagreb, which is an interesting one. Now, Betis are crap at home in Europe, especially in knockout European competition. I think that they haven't won any of their last 7, if I'm not mistaken, which makes things pretty uncomfortable. Good win at the weekend against Cadiz for Betis, but Pablo Fornals was pretty key to that, and he's been left out of the squad for the Conference League for reasons I simply cannot fathom. So we're in a difficult place when it comes to Betis. It's been a really up and down season. It's been a major transitional season. There's been a lot of change, especially in January, the busiest of all the Spanish sides with ins and outs. This side, on paper, should have enough to beat Dinamo Zagreb, especially at the Via Marine. But you kind of look at what's happening here, the lack of Isco, which is an incredibly bad thing for Betis, considering how good he's been. It's a bad thing for everyone because Isco is joy, but it's an impeccably bad thing for Betis. There's a lot of players in the treatment room. Abner Vinicius is in there. Mark Bartra's in there. Jose Perez is in there. Guido Rodriguez is in there. Cedric Bakambu can't play yet because he's not back from, he's been back from AFCON for like 2 days, so he's probably not going to be in this side, which means that options are limited. I'm intrigued to see what this front three of Asana Diao, Rodri Sanchez, and Nabil Fekir behind William Jose does, because on paper, all 3 of those can win a game on their own. And they are the key to Betis getting this done. When you kind of look at Zagreb, there's a couple of players missing. Dermic is missing, Rog is missing, and Stojkovic is missing. They are 3rd in the Croatian top flight, which is not okay from a perspective you'd imagine of the bad blue boys who sit behind them and will be giving them a load of shite. But also there's been some pretty disappointing performances and results of late. They didn't win the derby against Lokomotiv Zagreb, which is a minor derby in kind of comparison to that huge rivalry with Hajduk Split. But equally, you kind of look at that and go, well, they will expect to beat the smaller Zagreb sides and dominate them in order to justify their place at the top tier of Croatian football. Obviously, the biggest side, or the most successful side in Croatia, the biggest side. Please don't kill me, Hajduk Split fans. But they are the most successful side. And you're kind of looking at this and going, well, should you be better? We know and we've seen Dinamo Zagreb cause headaches in this competition before. We've seen what the Maximir can do as a stadium. This is away from home at a ground, equally where, as I mentioned, Betis haven't been very good in knockout competition. But I expect Betis to win this game, just not by all that much. Not by all that much. And that takes us to our final question, which is from Chris Crimmins, who says, storylines to watch. UELtras is prime at Narrative FC. Now, I've talked about a lot of them already, but obviously that re-up between Feyenoord and Roma stands out. But I like the quiet narrative going on between Olympiacos and Ferencvaros, two former European powerhouses, the most successful and biggest clubs in Greece and Hungary, going head to head whilst not actually top of their domestic leagues, which is a pretty big shock for both of them. I think that provides a real sense of jeopardy to this game, and the atmosphere at both legs should be absolutely unbelievable. There's also the whole Green Brothers thing, because whilst Ferencvaros aren't officially gemelagioed or friendshipped with Panathinaikos, they are part of that friendship circle, which also includes Rapid Vienna. In fact, Rapid Vienna are the main point here. They have friendships with both Ferencvaros and Panathinaikos. The Green Brothers are often linked together, especially in this part of Europe, which means there's a loose connection between Ferencvaros and Panathinaikos. And Olympiacos and Panathinaikos hate each other. Their rivalry is known as the Derby of the Eternal Enemies. That probably shouldn't be ignored. And I think especially considering when Ferencvaros go to Athens, are Panathinaikos going to take in a team in green and white who are playing against their hated rivals? I think they absolutely will be. So that could be just to add a little bit of edge to what already should be a pretty good and relatively level game, I think. On a player level, Romelu Lukaku's ridiculous scoring record in the Europa League should be touched upon. He's only failed to score once in his last 17 games in this competition, and he's the fourth top scorer outright in its history. There's also that Rick Karsdorp angle, going back to Feyenoord where he came through, also went back on loan to. We're kind of out of the Roma picture for a while, brought back into it now. He should play, I think, today, considering where Roma are weak and strong and the rotations they need to make. It'll be interesting to see him back at the kite once again. And finally, Olivier Giroud haunting another French team to become the fourth oldest player to score in the knockouts. I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't rule it out by any stretch of the imagination. And that brings us to a close here on UELtras today. So all that's left for me to do is say thank you so much to all of you for tuning in. Thank you to the patrons who provided the questions for this episode. They've helped me to structure it. If you want to join, as I said at the top, there's a link in the YouTube description. If you're listening to this on Patreon, thank you so much for being part of the community. It really does mean the absolute world to us. Hope you enjoy everything in the Europa League and Conference League tonight, and I'll see you very shortly. Take it easy, gang. Peace.